April 1986, a city of nearly 50,000 people vanished in less than 36 hours, without a war, without a bomb, and without ever being allowed to return. Mothers left breakfast dishes on kitchen tables. Children abandoned toys in playgrounds. An amusement park stood ready for its grand opening, its Ferris wheel painted bright yellow against the spring sky, but it would never spin. How does a modern city simply disappear from the map? What happened inside Chernobyl reactor number 4 that night? Why were residents told the evacuation would last only a few days? And how did a routine safety test erase an entire city from history? This is the story of Pripyat, a place built on the promise of the atomic age, destroyed by the very technology it was created to serve. To understand how Pripyat died overnight, we have to understand how it was created. On February 4th, 1970, in the forests of northern Ukraine, construction began on what would become the Soviet Union's 9th Atomgrad, a city built entirely for nuclear workers. Its name was Pripyat. Just 3 kilometers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Pripyat was designed as a model Soviet city, a showcase of what the future could look like when powered by the atom. Within 16 years, it grew from empty marshland into a thriving urban centre of 49,360 people. The average resident was just 26 years old, young engineers, scientists, teachers and their families, drawn by good salaries, modern amenities, and the prestige of working on one of the world's most advanced nuclear facilities. Pripyat had everything. 13,414 apartments spread across 160 residential blocks, 15 kindergartens, 5 schools, a hospital with over 400 beds, 25 stores and 27 cafes. There were cultural palaces, cinemas and sports complexes, including the Azure swimming pool and the Avanhard Stadium. The city even had its own amusement park, complete with bumper cars and a towering Ferris wheel, scheduled to open on May 1, 1986, for the annual May Day celebrations. Pripyat wasn't just a city, it was the Soviet Union's vision of the future. And on the night of April 25, 1986, that future began to burn. At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, preparations were underway for a routine safety test on reactor number 4. The test was simple in concept: simulate a power outage and see if the turbine's residual momentum could generate enough electricity to power emergency cooling systems until backup generators kicked in. But nothing about that night would be simple. The test had been postponed from the day shift to the night shift, meaning it fell to less experienced operators working through the early morning hours. To conduct the test, critical safety systems had to be disabled, including the emergency core cooling mechanism. The reactor's power had been reduced too quickly earlier in the day, triggering a phenomenon called xenon poisoning, which made the reactor difficult to control. And there was something else, something the operators didn't fully understand. The RBMK-1000 reactor they were working with had a design flaw hidden deep in its physics. Under certain conditions, the very systems meant to shut it down could accelerate it instead. Before the test even began, the reactor was already unstable. At 1:23 in the morning, they pressed forward anyway. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the reactor itself. The RBMK-1000 was a Soviet design, massive, powerful, and unlike anything used in the West. It used graphite as a moderator and water as a coolant. On paper, it was efficient. In reality, it had a fatal flaw. It's called a positive void coefficient. In most reactors, if the coolant boils and turns to steam, the nuclear reaction slows down. It's a built-in safety feature. But in the RBMK design, the opposite happened. When water turned to steam, the reaction accelerated. This meant that under certain low-power conditions, exactly the conditions of the safety test, the reactor could spiral out of control. There was another problem: the control rods. These were supposed to be the emergency brake, inserted into the reactor to absorb neutrons and shut down the chain reaction. But the tips of these rods were made of graphite. When inserted into a reactor already unstable, they didn't slow the reaction immediately. For a few critical seconds, they made it worse. The operators that night didn't know this. The reactor's full design details were classified, even from the people running it. And on top of all this was the xenon poisoning, a neutron-absorbing gas that built up after the power reduction earlier in the day. It left the reactor in a precarious, unstable state. The reactor was designed to accelerate under the very conditions meant to shut it down. At 1:23:40 a.m., the test began. Within seconds, the reactor's power output surged, not gradually, exponentially. The operators saw the readings spike and hit the emergency shutdown button, the AZ-5 scram. The control rods began to descend into the core. But because of those graphite tips, reactivity increased first. The power surge became uncontrollable. Water inside the cooling channels flashed instantly to steam. Pressure built to catastrophic levels, and then explosion. Not a nuclear detonation, but a massive steam explosion that tore through the reactor like a bomb. Fuel channels ruptured. The 1,000-ton reactor lid, a steel and concrete disc the size of a small building, was blown clean off, flipping into the air and crashing down at an angle into the exposed core. A second explosion followed, likely from hydrogen or a secondary steam burst. The core was now open to the atmosphere. Over 190 tons of radioactive fuel and graphite lay exposed. And the graphite, superheated to over 2,000 degrees Celsius, began to burn. In seconds, the reactor went from unstable to uncontrollable. A plume of radioactive smoke began rising into the night sky, invisible but lethal, carrying with it isotopes that would spread across continents. The first responders were firefighters from the nearby station in Pripyat. They arrived within minutes, seeing flames shooting from the reactor building and debris scattered across the ground. Some of that debris was graphite from the reactor core, intensely radioactive. But the firefighters didn't know that. To them, it looked like chunks of asphalt or concrete. Some picked it up with their bare hands. Others stood directly in the smoke, breathing in particles of cesium, strontium, and plutonium. They fought the blaze with water hoses, climbing onto the reactor roof to stop the fire from spreading to the turbine hall and the other reactors. They had no protective gear beyond their standard uniforms, no dosimeters, no understanding of the radiation levels they were being exposed to. Within hours, the first symptoms appeared: nausea, vomiting, headaches, the early signs of acute radiation syndrome. By morning, 134 plant workers and firefighters were suffering from radiation sickness. 2 men, Valery Kodymchuk and Vladimir Shashanok, were killed instantly by the explosion itself. Kodymchuk's body was never recovered. It remains entombed in the ruins to this day. Over the following days, helicopters were deployed to drop sand, clay, lead, and boron onto the exposed reactor core, over 5,000 tons of material in total. Pilots flew mission after mission through the radioactive plume, their aircraft absorbing radiation with every pass. Miners were brought in to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor to install a cooling system and prevent the molten core from burning through the foundation into the groundwater below. By the end of the crisis, over 500,000 people, soldiers, miners, engineers, and volunteers, would be mobilized as liquidators, tasked with containing the disaster. Many of them had no idea they were sacrificing their lives. Within weeks, 28 of those initial responders would die from radiation exposure, burns covering their bodies, organs failing, immune systems collapsing. But even as the reactor burned, even as radiation spread across Europe, the people of Pripyat, sleeping just 3 kilometers away, were told nothing. On the morning of April 26th, residents of Pripyat woke to a normal Saturday. Children went outside to play. People prepared for weddings scheduled that afternoon. The city went about its day. But above them, the invisible plume continued to rise. Soviet authorities knew what had happened. They knew the radiation levels were climbing. But for more than 24 hours, they said nothing to the public. The official Soviet media remained silent. No warnings, no evacuations, no acknowledgement. Meanwhile, radiation detectors across Europe began to spike. On April 28th, 2 days after the explosion, scientists in Sweden detected abnormal levels of radioactive particles in the air. At first, they thought there had been a leak at one of their own facilities. But the isotopes didn't match. The wind patterns pointed east, toward the Soviet Union. Sweden demanded an explanation. Under mounting international pressure, the Kremlin finally issued a terse statement acknowledging an accident at Chernobyl. But in Pripyat, the silence continued. The reactor was burning, but the city was still being told everything was normal. By the afternoon of April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion, the radiation levels in Pripyat had reached lethal thresholds. Over 1,000 microsieverts per hour in some areas, hundreds of times above safe limits. The decision was finally made: evacuate the city. At 2 p.m., a convoy of over 1,200 buses rolled into Pripyat. They formed long lines along the city's main roads, engines idling, waiting. Loudspeakers crackled to life. Residents were told to gather their documents, a few days' worth of clothing, and some food. The evacuation, they were assured, was temporary, a precautionary measure. They would return within 3 days, maybe a week at most. Leave your belongings, leave your pets, don't worry, you'll be back soon. People obeyed. Mothers packed small bags, fathers locked their apartment doors, leaving the keys on the table. Children said goodbye to their dogs and cats, promised they'd return. The buses filled quickly. Entire apartment blocks emptied in minutes. Within 3 hours, the city was deserted. 49,360 people gone. The buses drove south, toward the newly constructed city of Slavutych and other resettlement areas. Behind them, Pripyat stood silent, its streets empty, its windows dark, its amusement park frozen in anticipation of a celebration that would never come. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to months. No one was allowed to return. The evacuation zone expanded to 30 kilometers around the plant. Eventually, 188 settlements were abandoned. Over 350,000 people were displaced. Pripyat was evacuated in a single afternoon, and its people never returned. The area around Chernobyl is now known as the exclusion zone, 2,600 square kilometers of land deemed too contaminated for human habitation. It includes Pripyat, the power plant, and hundreds of villages and farms, forests, rivers, fields, all abandoned, all restricted. For decades, the zone was sealed. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Checkpoints monitored anyone trying to enter or leave. Inside, nature began to reclaim what humans had left behind. Buildings decayed, roofs collapsed, trees grew through windows, vines wrapped around rusting cars. The amusement park's Ferris wheel stood motionless, its yellow paint peeling, slowly being devoured by rust and time. Pripyat became a ghost town, a city preserved in the moment of its death, as if everyone had simply vanished mid-step. And in a way, they had. The explosion at Reactor 4 released an estimated 5,200 petabecquerels of radioactive material into the atmosphere, 400 times the fallout from the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The primary isotopes were iodine-131, with a half-life of just 8 days, cesium-137, with a half-life of 30 years, and strontium-90, with a half-life of 29 years. Iodine-131 was absorbed into the food chain almost immediately, particularly in milk. Children who drank contaminated milk in the weeks following the disaster were exposed to massive doses, leading to a surge in thyroid cancer cases. By 2005, over 6,000 cases of childhood thyroid cancer had been diagnosed in the affected regions. 15 were fatal. Cesium-137 and strontium-90 contaminated the soil, the water, and the food supply across a massive swathe of territory, 150,000 square kilometers across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Traces of radiation were detected as far away as Western Europe, Scandinavia, and even North America. The health impacts are still debated. The official estimates from the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization project between 4,000 and 9,000 additional cancer deaths over the lifetimes of the most exposed populations. Other organizations, including Greenpeace, estimate the number could be as high as 200,000, when factoring in lower dose exposures across Europe and the indirect effects of displacement, poverty, and psychological trauma. What is certain is this: millions of people were affected. Entire communities were uprooted. Farmland was rendered unusable, water sources were contaminated, and a psychological scar, referred to by some as radiophobia, spread through the population, fueling anxiety, depression, alcoholism, and even suicide. The disaster didn't just contaminate land, it contaminated lives. In the months following the disaster, Soviet engineers constructed a massive concrete structure over the destroyed reactor, a sarcophagus designed to contain the radiation. It was built hastily, under extreme conditions, by workers exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. They worked in shifts measured in seconds, running in, pouring concrete, running out. The sarcophagus was completed by December 1986. It held, but it was never meant to be permanent. Over the years, the structure began to crack and deteriorate. Rain seeped in. Radiation leaked out. By the 2000s, it was clear that a new solution was needed. In 2016, after years of international collaboration and over €2 billion in funding, a new structure was completed, the new safe confinement, a massive steel arch taller than the Statue of Liberty, designed to last 100 years. It was slid into place over the old sarcophagus in November 2016, sealing the reactor once more. Decommissioning of the site is projected to continue until at least 2065. The total economic cost of the Chernobyl disaster is estimated at over $700 billion globally, a price paid not just by the Soviet Union, but by the world. Section D. Pripyat, today, 17 to 30, 1830. Today, Pripyat remains frozen in time. The streets are empty. Buildings stand hollow, their windows shattered. Their walls covered in graffiti left by illegal visitors known as stalkers. The hospital where contaminated firefighters were treated still holds their uniforms, too radioactive to move, buried in the basement. The amusement park's bumper cars sit rusted and overgrown. The Ferris wheel has never turned. But life, in its own way, has returned. In the absence of humans, wildlife has flourished. Wolves, lynx, wild boar, and even endangered Przewalski's horses roam the exclusion zone. Birds nest in abandoned buildings. The forests have regrown, denser than before. It's a strange, paradoxical wilderness, radioactive, yet thriving. Since 2011, controlled tourism has been allowed. Visitors can take guided tours through the zone, walking the streets of Pripyat, standing in front of the reactor, seeing the sarcophagus up close. Over 124,000 people visited in 2019 alone. In 2022, during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the exclusion zone was briefly occupied by Russian forces. For weeks, the world held its breath, fearing sabotage or another disaster. By April, Ukrainian forces reclaimed the site. The city remains frozen in time. Pripyat didn't disappear because of war or invasion. It didn't vanish because of a natural disaster or an act of terrorism. It disappeared because of secrecy, silence, and a system that believed it could never fail. The reactor that destroyed Pripyat had known flaws that were kept hidden, even from the people operating it. The safety test that triggered the explosion was conducted under conditions that violated protocol by operators who didn't fully understand the machine they were controlling. And when the disaster struck, the response was denial, not transparency, not immediate action, but silence. For 36 hours, a burning reactor spewed radiation into the air, while a city of 50,000 people went about their lives, unaware. The evacuation was framed as temporary to avoid panic, but it was a lie. The people of Pripyat would never return. Today, the city stands as a monument, not to Soviet achievement, but to the cost of hubris, a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, is only as safe as the systems and people that control it. Pripyat is still on the map. You can find it on Google Earth. You can visit it, walk its streets, stand in its empty squares. But it is no longer a city. The city still exists, not as a place to live, but as a warning written in concrete and radiation.